Chapter 7 of A Birding on a Bronco by Florence A. Merriam. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Around our ranch house. Close up under the hills, the old vine-covered ranch house stood within a circle of great spreading live oaks. The trees were full of noisy, active blackbirds, brewer's blackbirds, relatives of the rusty that we know in New York. The ranchman told me that they always came up the valley from the vineyard to begin gathering straws for their nests on his brother's birthday, the 25th of March. After that time, it was well for passers below to beware. If an unwary cat, or even a hen or turkey gobbler, chanced under the blackbird's tree, half a dozen birds would dive down at it, screaming and scolding till the intruders beat an humble retreat. But the blackbirds were not always the aggressors. I heard a great outcry from them one day, and ran out to find them collecting at the tree in front of the house. A moment later a hawk flew off with a young nestling, and was followed by an angry black mob. One pair of the blackbirds nested in the oak by the side of the house, over the hammock. Though making themselves so perfectly at home on the premises, driving off the ranchman's cats and gobblers, and drinking from his watering trough, if they were taken at close quarters, with young in their nests, the noisy birds were astonishingly timid. One could hardly understand it in them. One afternoon I sat under the tree to watch them. Mountain Billy rested his bridle on my knee, and the ranchman's dog came out to join us. But the mother blackbird, though she came with food in her bill and started to walk down the branch over our heads, stopped short of the nest when her eye fell on us. She shook her tail and called "Chack!" and her mate, who sat near, opened wide his bill and whistled "Chee!" The small birds were hungry and grew impatient, seeing no cause for delay, so raised their three fuzzy heads above the edge of the nest and sent imperative calls out of their three empty throats. As the parents did not answer the summons, the young dozed off again, but when the old ones did get the courage to light near the nest, there was such a rousing chorus that they flew off alarmed for the safety of their clamorous brood. After that outbreak, it seemed as if the mother bird would never go back to her children, but finally she came to the tree and, after edging along falteringly, lit on a branch above them. The instant she touched foot, however, she was seized with nervous qualms, and turned round and round, spreading her tail fan fashion, as if distracted. To my surprise, it was the father bird who first went to the nest, though he had the wit to go to it from the outside of the tree, where he was less exposed to my dangerous glance. I wondered whether it was mother love that kept her from the nest when he ventured, or merely a case of masculine common sense versus nerves. How birds could imagine more harm would be done by going to the nest than by making such a fuss 5 feet away from it was a poser to me. Perhaps they attribute the same intelligence to us that some of us do to them. While the blackbirds were making such a time over our heads, I watched the hummingbirds buzzing around the petunias and pink roses under the ranch house windows, and darting off to flutter about the tubular flowers of the tobacco tree by the well. One day the small boy of the family climbed up to the hummingbird's nest in the oak to see if there were eggs yet, and the frightened brood popped out before his eyes. His sister caught one of them and brought it into the house. When she held it up by the open door, the tiny creature spread its little wings and flew out into the vines over the window. The child was so afraid its mother would not find it, she carried it back to its oak and watched till the mother came with food. The hummers were about the flowers in front of the window so much that when the front door was left open, they often came into the room. In an oak behind the barn I found a hummingbird's nest, and yielding to temptation, took out the eggs to look at them. In putting them back, one slipped and dropped on the hard ground, cracking the delicate pink shell as it fell. The egg was nearly ready to hatch, and I felt as guilty as if having killed a hummingbird. When in the hammock under the oak one day, I saw a pair of odd-looking Arizona hooded orioles busily going and coming to a drooping branch on the edge of the tree. They had a great deal to talk about as they went and came, and when they had gone I found, to my great satisfaction, that they had begun a nest. They often used the gray Spanish moss, but here had found a good substitute in the orange-colored parasitic vine of the meadows, known among the people of the valley as the love vine, dodder. The whole pocket was composed of it, making it a very gaudy nest. Linnets nested in the same old tree. Indeed, it is hard to say where these pretty rosy house finches, cousins of our purple finches, would not take it into their heads to build. They nested over the front door, in the vines over the windows, in the oaks and about the outbuildings, and their happy musical songs rang around the ranch house from morning till night. As I listened to their merry roundelay day after day during that beautiful California spring, it sounded to me as though they said, "How pretty it is out! How pretty it is out! How pretty it is!" The linnets are ardent little wooers, singing and dancing before the indifferent birds they would win for their mates. I once saw a rosy lover throw back his pretty head and hop about before his brown lady till she was out of patience and turned her back on him. When that had no effect, she opened her bill, spread her wings, and leaned toward him as if saying, "If you don't stop your nonsense, I'll—" But the fond linnet's gallantry and tenderness were not all spent in the wooing. When the mother bird was brooding her nest over our front door, her crimson-throated mate stood on the peak of the ridgepole above and sang blithely to her, turning his head and looking down every little while to make sure that she was listening to his pretty prattle. One of the birds that nested in the trees by the ranch house was the bee-bird, who was soft gray above and delicate yellow below, instead of dark gray above and shining white below like his eastern relative, the kingbird. The birds used to perch on the bare oak limbs, fly-catching. It was interesting to watch them. They would fly obliquely into the air and then turn, with bills bristling with insects, and sail down on outstretched wings, their square tails set so that the white outer feathers showed to as good advantage as the white border of the kingbird's does in similar flights. They made a bulky, untidy nest in the oaks by the barn, using a quantity of string borrowed from the ranchman. Their voices were high-keyed and shrill with an impatient emphasis, and at a distance suggested the shrill yelping of the coyote. "Kia! Ki-ki-kia!" they would cry. The wolves were so often heard around the ranch house that in the early morning I have sometimes mistaken the birds for them. One of the favorite hunting grounds of the bee-birds was the orchard, where they must have done a great deal of good destroying insects. They were quarrelsome birds, and were often seen falling through the air fighting vigorously. I saw one chase a sparrowhawk and press it so hard that the hawk cried out lustily. The ranchman's son told me of one bee-bird who defended his nest with his life. Two crows lit in a tree where the flycatcher had a nest containing eggs. The crows had difficulty in getting to the tree to begin with, for the bee-birds fought them off, and though they lighted, were soon dislodged and chased down the vineyard. The man was at work there, and as the procession passed over his head, the bee-bird dove at the crow. The crow struck back at him, crushing his skull, and the flycatcher dropped through the air dead. The other bee-bird followed its dead mate to the ground, and then, without a cry, flew to a tree and let the crows go on their way. The bee-bird was one of the noisiest birds about the ranch house, but commoner than he, in fact, the most abundant bird next to the linnet and the blackbird, was the California chewink, or, as the ranchman appropriately called him, the brown chippy, for he does not look like the handsome chewink we know, but is a fat, dun-brown bird with a thin chip that he utters on all occasions. He is about the size of the eastern robin, and except when nesting, almost as familiar. There were brown chippies in the dooryard, brown chippies around the barns, and brown chippies in the brush, till one got tired at the sight of them. The temptations that come to conscientious observers are common to humanity, and one of the subtlest is to undervalue what is at hand and overvalue the rare or distant. Unless a bird is peculiarly interesting, it requires a definite effort to sit down and study him in your own dooryard, or where he is so common as to be an everyday matter. The chippies were always sitting around, scratching or picking up seeds, or else quarreling among themselves. Feeling that it was my duty to watch them, I reasoned with myself, but they seemed so mortally dull and uninteresting it was hard work to give up any time to them. When they went to nesting, their wild instincts asserted themselves, and they hid away so closely I was never sure of but one of their nests, and that was only by most cautious watching. Then for the first time they became interesting. To my surprise, one day I heard a brown chippy lift up his voice and sing. It was in a sunny grove of oaks, and though his song was a queer, squeaky warble, it had in it a good deal of sweetness and contentment, for the bird seemed to find life very pleasant. The ranchman's son told me that up in the canyons at dusk he had sometimes heard towhee concerts, the birds answering each other from different parts of the canyon. There was a nest in the chaparral which probably belonged to these chewinks. It was in a mass of poison ivy that had climbed up on a scrub oak. I spent the best part of a morning waiting for the birds to give in their evidence. Brown sentinels were posted on high bare brush tops, where they chipped at me, and once a brown form flew swiftly away from the nest bush, but like most people whose conversation is limited to monosyllables,